Nebraska Scientific, a division of Seargas Company Incorporated, presents an introductory guide to the anatomy of the bullfrog. Bullfrogs are a member of the class Amphibia, the world's oldest group of four-footed vertebrates. As represented on our zoological chart, these amphibians descended from a line of bony fish appearing on the earth before any of the reptiles. In fact, the first frogs and their relative the salamander were present during the period of the dinosaurs. Amphibians, which include bullfrogs, grass frogs, leopard frogs, salamanders, and toads, number more than 3,900 different species, attributed to their ability to adapt to changing conditions. The word amphibia implies a double life. For most species, this means spending some time on land and returning to water to breed. The bullfrog, Rana catsbiana, and its relative the leopard frog, Rana pipiens, are both widespread North American species and typical representatives of modern frogs. Both have been used extensively in research and are the two most commonly used in classroom dissections. Although amphibians are unique among the vertebrates in many ways, they share a host of similarities with other land-dwelling forms, including mammals. During the course of this video, the following topics will each be examined: terms of orientation, external anatomy, major voluntary muscles, digestive system, respiratory system, circulatory system, urogenital system, basic anatomy of the brain. Here to lead the examination of the bullfrog is Dr. James Platts, Professor of Biology at Creighton University. Dr. Platts received his PhD in vertebrate zoology from Arizona State University. His published research over the last 2 decades has primarily involved describing new species of leopard frogs here in North America.
The demonstration which follows is designed to aid your understanding of the vertebrate body, whether you're planning to do a dissection or simply wish to use it for review. In either case, it will help you to appreciate vertebrate structure, function, and some of the special adaptations of the amphibian life forms around you. All zoologists rely on special terms which help describe or locate a particular feature with respect to others. Terms used during the course of this exercise adhere to formal conventions as they apply to amphibians.
Features which lie closer to the head are said to lie anterior to another feature. For example, the tip of the snout is a feature which lies anterior in position to the eyes. In the same fashion, if something lies further toward the back end, it is said to lie posterior to another feature. For example, the upper arm of the front limb, seen here, is posterior to the tip of the snout. The upper surface, or back of the frog, is called the dorsal surface. The undersurface of the frog is called the ventral surface. Once we begin to consider internal structures, these two terms can also be used to describe the position of one feature relative to another. Features are said to be medial if they lie close to the midline of the body along an imaginary line or axis that runs from the tip of the snout to the base of the body. Anything that lies farther out in either direction is said to be lateral. For example, the eyes are located lateral to the midline. Structures that run at right angles to the anterior-posterior axis are said to be transverse to the midline. Often we will make transverse incisions with a scalpel or scissors. First, let's take a look at the external features of the bullfrog. The body can be divided into 2 parts, the head and the trunk. Just posterior to the tip of the snout is a pair of small openings, here and here, called external nares. Each has a small cover of skin called the narial flap, which allows the frog to open or close the nares during the breathing cycle. Just posterior to the external nares is a pair of large eyes. Each is equipped with a pigmented, movable upper eyelid and a much smaller, immovable lower eyelid. An additional membrane, called the nictitating membrane, is transparent in living specimens and functions as a third eyelid, which can be drawn upward or dorsally across the eye for protection as the frog enters the water. Further posterior on the head are located paired tympanums. These membranes function as eardrums, just as they do in other vertebrates which have the ability to hear. Now let's turn our attention to the trunk anatomy. Frogs have 4 well-developed appendages. The front limbs are rather short. They consist of an upper arm, a forearm, a wrist, and a hand. Each hand has 4 fingers rather than 5. If your specimen is an adult male, you may be able to locate an enlarged, darkened thumb pad, which is used to hold tightly to the female during reproduction. The hind limbs are much longer and more powerful than the front ones. Each hind limb consists of an upper portion, the thigh, followed by a lower shank, an ankle, and a foot. Notice here that the hind feet have 5 toes each, and a thin membrane of skin extending between each toe to create webbed feet. The powerful hind limbs and webbed feet are ideally suited for swimming in the water as well as for hopping on land. Located between the hind legs is a small opening and a chamber within. The opening is the cloacal opening, which leads to the cloacal chamber. Through it will pass urinary products from the kidneys and fecal material from the intestines. During the breeding season, reproductive products, either egg or sperm, are also shed through this opening. Now let's take a look at the skin of the frog. In life, the dorsal surface of the skin is green and brown because of pigment cells called chromatophores. This color helps the frog blend in with its surroundings, making it less easily seen by predators. The ventral surface is off-white and represents a case of counter-shading. Counter-shading makes the swimming frog less easily seen from below when the sky is light. The skin of the bullfrog is very thin, flexible, and permeable to water, meaning that water can pass through it easily. Because of these skin qualities, frogs don't drink water, but simply absorb it through the skin. As a consequence, frogs also lose body water rapidly and must stay in or near water in order to survive. Because the skin is very vascular or filled with blood vessels, frogs are also able to obtain oxygen from both the air and water. This capacity allows bullfrogs to spend the winter on the bottom of ice-covered ponds. Under these conditions, all of the oxygen needs can be met through the skin, and the lungs won't be used again until spring, when the ice cover melts and the frogs emerge. The skin also contains many microscopic mucus glands. Mucus keeps the skin moist, aiding in cutaneous respiration, and slows the rate of water loss to the air. In other species of frogs, modified mucus glands, called granular glands, produce chemical irritants, and in some, toxins which are used as a defense against predators. In order to observe important features in the mouth, first cut the bony junction between the upper and lower jaws at the posterior margin of each jaw here and here. Heavy shears are useful for this purpose. Notice first that the roof of the mouth has paired internal nares, seen here and here. Air from the external nares enters the mouth cavity through these 2 openings in the roof of the mouth. Located medial to the internal nares are the vomerine teeth. Much smaller teeth are found along the margins of the upper jaw. These are the maxillary teeth. Note that, as is the case in most species of frogs, there are no teeth along the margin of the lower jaw. Teeth are useful only in holding prey, since frogs do not chew their food. The two areas in the back of the eye sockets, in the roof of the mouth, here and here, represent retractor bulbi muscles. Contraction depresses the eyes downward into the mouth cavity as an aid to swallowing. At the rear of the mouth cavity is a large opening, the entrance to the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube responsible for transporting food to the stomach. Just ventral to the esophagus is the glottis, an opening which leads to the trachea and eventually to the lungs. Note the large fleshy tongue in the floor of the throat. If you grasp it at the free edge with forceps and lift it forward, you will see that it is attached at the anterior margin of the mouth cavity, unlike most other vertebrates. The tongue is hinged at the front and is quite sticky in live specimens. It can be quickly extended and retrieved to grab passing insects. Lateral to the esophagus are openings on either side of the mouth cavity, here and here, which mark the entrance to the eustachian tubes. Each one connects to a middle ear cavity. These tubes aid in balancing the air pressure on either side of the tympanum, much as they do in humans. If your specimen is a male, it will contain an additional pair of openings just lateral to the eustachian tubes. Each opening leads into a vocal sac. Air passing into the vocal sacs allows each to act as a resonating chamber while the male is producing the mating call. Mating calls are an important part of courtship in frogs, and the range of sounds among the many species extends from croaks to snores to loud trilling sounds. The mating call actually originates in the larynx, just posterior to the glottis. Air rushes across the vocal cords found in the larynx, causing them to vibrate. This completes the examination of the external features of the bullfrog.
Now let's review some of what we've learned. Frogs originated before the dinosaurs and have survived as a group long after the last of the ruling reptiles became extinct. Frogs have thin skin, which absorbs water, but at the same time makes them susceptible to dehydration. Therefore, they must stay near a moisture source in order to survive. In Section 3, we will examine major skeletal muscles of the frog. As discussed in Section 1, we will use zoological terms descriptive of body planes and directions. In addition, the muscle names will adhere to standard zoological convention for amphibians. This avoids the common mistake of applying mammalian names to some of the muscles, which are not the same ones in frogs.
Before we begin to consider muscle placement and function, let's review some basic facts about muscles, which will help us as we examine the bullfrog. Simple muscles consist of a mid-region called the belly and are usually anchored at each end to some other structure, generally a skeletal element. Because one end of the muscle is more or less stationary during contraction, it is called the origin, while the other end, the one which undergoes greater motion, is called the insertion. Contraction of the upper muscle draws the leg closer to the body. This action is called flexion. Muscles often work in opposition to one another, or antagonistically. Note that if the upper muscle is relaxed and the lower one contracted, the leg can be made to return to its former position. This action of straightening the limb or increasing the angle between the two elements is called extension. Now that you know what happens when muscles contract, let's consider some additional common movements which limbs can undergo. If the leg is moved toward the anterior portion of the body, it is undergoing protraction. Pulling the leg in a posterior direction is considered the opposite of protraction and is known as retraction. Limbs can also be pulled in toward the midventral body line, which is called adduction. Likewise, using muscles which act antagonistically to these would move the limb out away from the midline, a process called abduction. Now let's move to a consideration of how we should go about examining the muscles of the frog. In order to examine the ventral muscles of the frog, it will be necessary to make incisions along the lines drawn as shown here. Use forceps to grasp the skin up at a point just anterior to the cloacal opening and make a small cut with sharp scissors or a scalpel through the skin. Be careful at this point not to cut so deeply as to enter the abdominal muscle layers beneath the skin. Then extend the incision anteriorly until it reaches the junction of the lower jaws. Complete the process by cutting transversely across the chest, just posterior to the front limbs. Do the same just anterior to the hind limbs. Now pull the skin away from the underlying muscles on the right side of the frog, as seen here to the left side of your screen. One more cut is necessary before we begin to observe the muscles on the ventral surface. Use a scalpel or scissors to cut along the lower lip from the center following the outer margin of the chin on the right side. Pinning or holding the skin aside will make it easier to identify muscles. Much of the chin is covered by a large muscle called the intermandibularis, which is involved in the swallowing process and also in the breathing cycle. The process of getting air in and out of the lungs of a frog is complex, involving coordinating opening and closing of the narial flaps and the glottis, while the chin muscles change the volume of air in the mouth cavity. In Section 5 on respiration, we will consider the breathing process in more detail. The majority of the remaining muscles are involved in body movements. Moving posteriorly, note the short muscle on the upper arm. This muscle is the deltoid, which draws the arm forward. Remember, the technical term for this motion is protraction. The large muscle mass here is called the pectoralis. It is made up of 3 components, all of which are involved in movement of the upper arm. Together they help flex the forearm and draw the upper arm closer to the body. This last movement is an example of adduction, which implies that the limb is being drawn in toward the midline. The body wall is covered with a sheet of muscle called the external oblique. It is quite thick and provides support and protection of lateral portions of the abdominal cavity. Medial to the external oblique is another muscle of the lower trunk called the rectus abdominis. It is a thick supportive muscle system lying in the midline of the ventral surface of the chest and abdomen. It completes our coverage of the major ventral muscles of the head and trunk. The hind limb is extremely well developed and contains a number of muscles used in swimming and hopping. First, let's examine the ventral ones, from lateral to medial. The muscle which occupies the anterior border of the thigh is called the triceps femoris. It can be seen from both the ventral and the dorsal surfaces. Medial to the triceps femoris is the adductor longus. Its action draws the limb toward the midline, or again, as the name implies, it adducts the hind limb. Medial to the adductor longus is the sartorius. It helps flex the shank and adduct the entire hind limb. The adductor magnus, the small triangular-shaped muscle, medial to the sartorius, also helps adduct the hind limb. The gracilis major is the large, thick muscle occupying the medial surface of the thigh. Its action extends the thigh and helps flex the knee. The gracilis minor is a thin slip of muscle which covers the posterior surface of the gracilis major. It functions much like the gracilis major, and completes the series of ventral thigh muscles. On the shank ventrally, there are two large muscles, one on either side of the bones of the lower leg. Shown here is the tibialis anticus longus on the lateral surface. The larger, more medial muscle is the plantaris longus. Both of these muscles contribute to extending the foot. In order to examine the dorsal muscles of the hind limb, pull the skin away from the rest of the thigh and lower leg. Again, note the triceps femoris, visible on the lateral surface of the thigh. All three muscles of this complex are visible here. The first element, the cruralis, lies along the anterior margin of the thigh. The anterior portion of the cruralis is overlain by a slender muscle called the tensor fasciae lata. The third segment of the triceps femoris is called the gluteus magnus and lies medial to the cruralis. Together, these three muscles protract the thigh and extend the lower leg at the knee. Posterior to the gluteus magnus is a somewhat cylindrical muscle called the iliofibularis. It and the larger semimembranosus, just lateral to it, complete the dorsal thigh muscles. These two muscles work somewhat antagonistically to each other to move the thigh in two different directions. The semimembranosus adducts the thigh, moving it toward the midventral center line, while the iliofibularis moves the thigh away from the midline of the body. Remember, this last movement is known as abduction, the opposite of adduction. Two well-defined muscles complete the shank or lower leg. The smaller lateral one is the peroneus, which helps extend the lower leg from the knee. The larger, more medial one is the plantaris longus, seen here from the dorsal view. The lateral one is the peroneus, which helps extend the lower leg from the knee. The larger, more medial one is the plantaris longus, seen here from the dorsal view. Now that we have completed the hind limbs, let's examine some of the major muscles of the dorsal surface of the head and trunk. To do this, go ahead and remove the skin from the dorsal surface of the frog. As you remove the skin, note again that it is quite well supplied with blood vessels. Use care in removing the bands of tissues which connect the skin to the connective tissue covering the musculature. Leave the skin around the tympanum in place. Three well-defined muscles can be seen starting just posterior to the tympanum. The first is the depressor mandibula, which is active in opening the mouth. Just posterior to this is the dorsalis scapula. Its primary function is to adduct the upper arm. The third in this series acts to help complete the motion of the dorsalis scapula in moving the upper arm, and is named the latissimus dorsi. Lateral and posterior to these is a broad sheet of muscle called the external oblique, which descends to the ventral side to contain and protect the organs of the abdominal region. Now that we have examined the musculature, let's review some of our general findings before we go on to consider the internal organ systems.
Now let's review section 3. All muscles are much alike in that they contract to bring about movement. Most are easily defined and have a belly, origin, and insertion point. Muscles often work in opposition to each other, that is, antagonistically, in order that a limb can be moved in one direction and then return to its original position. The breathing mechanism is unique among the living amphibians and requires a much more complex series of movements than in other vertebrates.
In order to view the digestive system and other visceral organs, make a small incision along the midline at the posterior limit of the abdominal cavity. Then make 2 additional transverse cuts as well. Because the pectoral girdle lies in the path of the first incision, it helps to use strong scissors to cut across the girdle as the cut approaches the throat musculature. Placing a blunt probe in the mouth verifies continuity with the esophagus, which carries food to the stomach. The primary function of the stomach is to store food prior to digestion in the intestine. The junction between stomach and intestine is marked by the pylorus of the stomach, a region which contains the pyloric valve. The pyloric valve controls movement of food into the upper portion of the small intestine, where most digestive processes begin. In humans, the small intestine can be further regionalized from anterior to posterior as the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. This distinction cannot be made in frogs. 3 organs in this region provide digestive enzymes to aid in the breakdown of food. The large 3-lobed liver produces bile, which speeds up the rate of digestion of fats. Although bile is manufactured in the liver, it is stored temporarily in the gallbladder, here, beneath the liver. When needed, bile is carried into the small intestine through a tube, known as the bile duct. Several digestive enzymes are produced by the pancreas. The pancreas lies between the stomach and the adjacent intestinal wall, embedded in a thin, translucent sheet of support tissue called the mesentery. The small intestine is also supported by mesentery. The small intestine terminates here and is followed by a short enlarged region called the large intestine. By this point, most of the food material has been digested and absorbed across the intestinal lining into the bloodstream for immediate use or stored in the liver for future needs. From the large intestine, fecal material will be eliminated through the cloaca, which we noted during examination of the external anatomy.
Once again, let's review what we've learned in this section. Frogs have a well-developed stomach for temporary storage of food. Food movement into the intestine is regulated by a pyloric valve at the lower end of the stomach. The upper portion of the intestine is small in diameter and is involved in the digestion of food. Digestion of food is aided by enzymes from the liver and the pancreas. Food is absorbed in the lower half of the small intestine. Fecal material is passed from the large intestine out of the body through the cloacal opening.
Frogs obtain oxygen through the skin, as already discussed in Section 2. Most frogs also utilize paired lungs to obtain oxygen from the air, and some gas exchange takes place in the floor of the throat as well. The complete air path can be easily traced. Air enters through the external nares, here and here. It then empties into the mouth cavity through the internal nares, here and here. Next, air enters the glottis, at the rear of the mouth here. The blunt probe is inserted through the glottis in the floor of the throat, verifying that it connects to the lung. Air that is breathed in or inspired passes from the glottis to the trachea. The trachea is not seen here, as it lies just dorsal to the larynx, seen here. From the trachea, air moves to each lung by way of a short bronchial tube. The lung is a thin vascular sac. In the microscopic capillary beds of the lungs, oxygen is taken up from the inspired air, and carbon dioxide, a byproduct from metabolic processes in the body, is released from the blood. How air gets in and out of the system is a truly complex process. Because frogs lack ribs or a diaphragm, which mammals have, they cannot use the same sort of breathing mechanism common to reptiles, birds, and mammals. In fact, frogs cannot breathe air in and out of the lungs while the mouth is open. It must be closed. The cycle is depicted here in animated form. In step 1, the chin muscles are relaxed and the external nares are open. At this time, the glottis is closed. In the second phase, with the narial flaps open, the chin muscles contract, moving the floor of the throat dorsally, which reduces the volume and forces air out of the mouth cavity. In the third phase, muscles depress the floor of the throat while the narial flaps remain open and the glottis is closed. This action again produces an increased volume of air in the throat. Now the glottis opens. The air which has been held in the lungs from the last cycle of breathing is now exhaled through the open external nares. Exhalation occurs because air pumped into the lungs meets resistance from the walls. So in effect, the lungs are under pressure. Next, the frog closes the narial flaps and elevates the floor of the throat through muscle contraction. Because the glottis is open, air is forced back into the lungs. Finally, the glottis is closed, while the external nares are opened once again. The muscles in the floor of the throat then relax, allowing air to enter the mouth cavity through the open narial flaps, and the cycle is ready to repeat again.
Now let's review some of the major points. Frogs have 3 ways of obtaining oxygen. Some of it is obtained through the highly vascular skin. A portion of its oxygen needs can be met by absorption in the floor of the throat. Oxygen can also be taken up in the thin, sac-like lungs. Frogs are unusual in the way that they breathe air. Air that reaches the lungs is driven by a special pumping mechanism using muscles in the chin region. This amphibian way of breathing is often said to be driven by a buccal force pump. Frogs cannot breathe air in and out of the lungs if the mouth is open.
You will note as we examine this frog that the arteries have been injected with red latex and the veins with blue latex for easy identification. First, remove the thin, tough pericardial sac which surrounds the heart. The heart of an amphibian is considered to be 3-chambered. Anteriorly are 2 chambers called atria. Attached to the right atrium is a thin-walled sac known as the sinus venosus. The sinus venosus receives blood low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide from all parts of the body. 3 major veins, shown here, injected with blue latex, collect the blood from the body and carry it to the sinus venosus. From the head region, there are paired anterior vena cavae, here and here. The third vessel, the posterior vena cava, collects blood from the rest of the body. Contraction of the right atrium carries blood into the heavy walled chamber of the heart, here, known as the ventricle. Contraction of the ventricle carries blood low in oxygen out of the heart through the pulmocutaneous arteries. The right pulmocutaneous artery is one of 3 vessels which lies within the wall of the right truncus arteriosus and carries blood to the right lung. The left pulmocutaneous artery lies inside the left truncus arteriosus and delivers blood to the left lung. Once oxygenated in the capillary beds of the lungs, the blood returns to the heart through the left atrium, again descending into the ventricle. This time, blood exits through additional vessels which branch off the right and left truncus arteriosus to supply oxygenated blood to the head region through the carotid arteries, here and here, or to the rest of the body through the systemic arches, here and here. Although the spleen is located here in the mesentery, beside the large intestine, and quite remote from the heart, it is an important part of the circulatory system because it manufactures, stores, and at times destroys blood cells.
Here are some major points for review. Frogs have a heart containing 3 contractile chambers. The atria pump blood into the ventricle. In the case of the right atrium, blood low in oxygen is returning from the body. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood returning from the lungs. It is the ventricle which propels blood to the lungs to be oxygenated, and on return to the ventricle as oxygenated blood, it is then pumped to all parts of the body.
In the majority of male vertebrates, there is a close association between the urinary system and the ducts which transport sperm. Amphibians are no exception, and so we will consider the male urogenital system first. The 2 small, light-colored oval structures are called the testes, here and here. Each testis is responsible for producing male gametes, called sperm. From the testes, sperm are transported through a series of small ducts called the vas efferentia into a single larger duct known as the archinephric duct. This duct is often misnamed the ureter, which is not seen in amphibians, but does occur in reptiles, birds, and mammals. The archinephric duct is the same one which removes urine from the kidneys in both males and females. It lies here, along the lateral border of each kidney. From the archinephric ducts, urine is transported to the urinary bladder, seen here. Injection of latex may cause the kidneys to appear as blue masses lateral to the testes. Urine and during the breeding season, sperm are transported down the archinephric ducts to the cloaca. Both sexes use the kidneys to carry out 2 vital functions. The kidneys excrete urine, which carries toxic byproducts of metabolism, such as ammonia, urea, and in some frogs, uric acid. The kidneys also regulate the water content of body tissues. Associated with the reproductive system of both sexes is a large series of yellowish finger-like objects. These are fat bodies and represent stored energy to be used only during the spring reproductive season. Fat bodies are present in the frog throughout the winter. They are used up during the breeding season and then replenished before winter sets in again. Most specimens will show these structures. Female bullfrogs produce from 5,000 to 10,000 or more gametes called eggs in a single breeding season. Here each small dark sphere represents a single egg. All of those seen here are contained within the paired ovaries. Unlike males, females rely on a duct separate from the urinary tract to transport eggs to the cloaca. Here, underneath the egg mass, is one of the 2 highly folded oviducts. Oviducts transport eggs to the outside of the body by way of the cloaca. The vast majority of frogs have external fertilization, which is accomplished when the male clasps the female in an act called amplexus. During amplexus, the female extrudes eggs, and as she does, the male sheds sperm over them to permit fertilization. The entire process may take hours. Successful fertilization of an egg by a sperm results in an embryo. Embryonic development results in a tadpole, which looks like this preserved specimen of a bullfrog tadpole. In time, the tadpole resorbs its large tail, develops legs, and transforms through a process known as metamorphosis into a tiny copy of the adult body plan, and the cycle is complete.
In review of Section 7, amphibians have separate male and female sexes. Adults produce sex cells called gametes. In males, these are known as sperm. In females, they are known as eggs. Females may lay several thousand eggs per season. Both sexes rely on the kidneys to remove nitrogenous-based waste products from the body. The kidneys also play a major role in regulating body water content.
In order to observe the brain, it is first necessary to remove all muscle and connective tissue from the median dorsal surface of the head. This will expose a series of bones running along the midline, which must be sliced away a little at a time. Once the bone is down to a thin layer, it is best to use scissors and forceps to chip out the last remaining bone. The small anterior-most pair of oval structures are the olfactory lobes. These receive sensory information coming in from receptor cells in the nose, which provide frogs with a sense of smell. Located posterior to the olfactory lobes are larger paired swellings, here and here, which represent the cerebral hemispheres. They receive sensory information from other parts of the body and correlate the information in preparation for response. Posterior to the cerebral hemispheres are two larger dorsal swellings called the optic lobes. The optic lobes are receiving points for sensory input coming from the eyes and function as an association center for other sensory input as well. In amphibians, portions of this region also contain the decision-making center of the brain. The single tubular portion of the brain just posterior to the optic lobes is known as the cerebellum. It is to this portion of the brain that sensory information from the ear, involved in hearing as well as equilibrium, is sent. A major responsibility of the cerebellum is the coordination of skeletal muscle activity involved in locomotion, feeding, and mating behavior. Posterior to the cerebellum is the medulla oblongata. It is organized internally into a series of dorsal nerve fiber tracts which carry sensory signals into the brain, and ventral nerve fiber tracts which carry motor impulses out to the muscles. It is a transition region at the posterior limits of the brain. From here, the brain tapers in size and becomes a series of nerve fiber tracts which exit the cranium or skull as the spinal cord, not visible here. Although they cannot be seen here, all along the length of the brain are 10 pairs of nerves which are connected to the brain. These are the cranial nerves. Outside the brain, along the vertebral column, is another set of paired nerves called the spinal nerves. These nerves carry information inward toward the brain through dorsal roots. Another series of ventral roots carry output signals to the muscles from the brain.
And now for our final review. The anterior-most portions of the brain are involved with olfaction. Toward the middle of the brain are paired optic lobes which are involved with visual signals. Other portions of the brain in this region are involved in decision-making and are therefore a sort of command center. Toward the posterior end of the brain is the cerebellum, which is involved in hearing, the sense of equilibrium, and coordination of complex muscle movements. Fiber tracts in the dorsal portion of the medulla oblongata carry signals inward from the body toward the brain. Fiber tracts in the ventral portion of the medulla oblongata carry signals out into the spinal column to the muscles. This completes our examination of the anatomy of the bullfrog, which represents one among the millions of interesting species which inhabit our Earth. The people at Nebraska Scientific hope that it has helped you develop a better understanding of life forms around you. For those of you who may wish to find out more about amphibians,